Okay, let's take a look at History Part 1. By the way, this unit I've only separated into 3 parts, so it's a short unit of content here. And we've already completed the arts, and we completed human sciences, is that right? So then this is our 3rd area of knowledge, okay? With the 2 big ones that I think you guys push last at the end, the natural sciences and the mathematics. The past is never dead. It's not even the past. Okay, so we're going to start with a little guided vision activity. Okay, here's what I need you guys to do. I know it's weird, but just follow me. Okay. Close your eyes, okay? Okay, close your eyes and engage your imagination. The whole closing the eyes thing is to engage the imagination. Okay, so here's the deal. Imagine you just woke up this morning, okay? I know that's pretty easy. And as you sit up in bed, okay, all of a sudden, nothing in your room looks familiar. Absolutely nothing. It's the same room you have, but nothing looks familiar, and you don't know your name. You don't know any history of your past at all. You don't know anything about yourself. You have completely lost your memory, and nothing in your room looks familiar. Now, you have some abilities still. You can still read, you can still talk, walk, all that, but you have no memory of your school experience. You don't know who you are. You don't know anything. But you find this note sitting on the bed beside you that says you got to meet Fred at Portage in Maine at 9:30. And you look at the clock and you can see it's 8 o'clock. You've got basically an hour to figure out who you are, who Fred is, and where are you, and what is this room that you have, okay? Okay, open your eyes. Based on this predicament, if you think about your actual room that you woke up in this morning, could you reconstruct who you are from the stuff that's in your room right now? Just your room. So, for example, something might be in there like your school bag. What could you use in your room right now to reconstruct who you are? Your phone, you said? Yeah. Okay, what's going to be on your phone that will tell you about you right now? Your name, okay. Your birthday. Pictures of you with other people, okay. So you flip through your pictures and go, oh, this might be somebody significant in my life, and this might be somebody significant. Now, you might even have pictures up in your room. What else would be in your room to help reconstruct this? Any of you have posters on the wall? Are they posters of like your history, or are they just posters of like bands you like or something like that, or movies you might like? Yeah. So that might tell you a little bit about yourself, like, oh, I guess I like that band. Now, what about the state of your room? How many of you got a messy room right now this morning? So what will that tell you about yourself? Oh, maybe I'm not the cleanest person, right? What are the things, what other artifacts in that room will help you reconstruct who you are? Well, there'll be clothes in there, right? Yeah. So you'll be like, oh, I guess I dress like this. I guess this is my style. What else? There'll be books. Okay, yeah, you'd be like, oh, I guess I play volleyball. There's a volleyball here. I guess I play volleyball. Oh, there's some skates over there. Maybe I play hockey. I don't know. Right? But think about, will it be enough to really describe you, the essence of what you are? Are all those artifacts in your room enough? Let's say it wasn't your room. Let's say it was your locker here at school and your school bag. Is that enough to construct you? Is that enough to construct who you are? Well, obviously the analogy I'm drawing here is, this is what historians do every day. They find artifacts, and from those artifacts they construct what they interpret the history to be. Okay, now this is a shocking thing, because the idea of losing your memory and who you are and then having to reconstruct it seems like an unrealistic situation, but it actually does happen. People can suffer brain injury and lose all their memories of who they are. As a matter of fact, some people who have suffered brain injury have then the whole idea of amnesia. Maybe you've heard it, right? People have suffered that injury and then had, when they recovered from it, were described as completely different people. Like, for example, they may have been a married person who was and then they couldn't maintain that marriage, or their whole personality changed as they reconstructed who they were, okay? So, as we start to look at history, we could start by looking at your own microhistory, okay? Make sense of your life by examining the history of your own life, right? So imagine you write the textbook of your own life's history, okay? So if we're going to do that, let's ask some important historical questions. Why should we care? Does it matter what you did in the past? Is that actually important to you? Is there a danger of being too obsessed with the past? Okay, is that a problem? Or is there a danger of ignoring the past? How good is your memory anyways? When you think about the past, are you being accurate in what you're remembering? If you were to keep a diary, that may be, no one mentioned that, by the way, that would be in your room, is a diary. If you did, what do you put in your diary? So for example, yesterday, just one day ago, what would you have written in your diary for yesterday? And what would you have left out? Okay? And when you look back on it 10 years ago and you say, I hated that, math quiz, is that really that important about what happened on that particular day, right? It's important to you now, but in the bigger picture, who knows? Okay, here's a question I actually want an honest answer to. Would you be more inclined to trust an autobiography written by a person or a history book written by somebody else about that person? Right? Like, let's say Adolf Hitler. Lots of people have written books about him, but if he wrote his own autobiography, which would you trust more? Why? Okay. It's hard to get away from biases, but it's a matter of trying to minimize them, right? So you might have this opinion that somebody else will have different biases or less biases writing about. But what's the advantage of the autobiography? Because it has an advantage too. Yeah, that's right. If you guys thought about it, if you could write your own autobiography versus your best friend writing a biography about you, I bet you could put stuff in that even they don't know about. But it might be interesting to see what their perspective on you is, okay? And then again, to what extent do you think people learn from their own mistakes? And in what way do they keep making the same mistakes? Is historical study an analysis of that? Okay, so before we get started, what do we even mean by history? Like, what does that mean? Is history just a collection of great events, or is it really lots of little details? Okay? When you guys did, and I can't remember if everyone was here when we did the activity on the board of ranking historical events, some of the stuff you guys did was the so-called great events ranked higher because of various reasons, including impact on the world. Okay? The past is another country. They do things different there. Do you sometimes think that? Like if you go far enough into the past, it seems like a whole other country or almost a whole other world to what was. I mean, I could show you guys pictures from my 1980s high school yearbook. It will look a lot different than the high school you guys are in right now. Okay, so let's start with the big question. What is history? Well, sure, it's a study of the past, absolutely. But it's definitely more complicated than that, okay? In order to study the past, the only way we can study it is the evidence for it, because we can't experience the past because it's already gone by. You guys can't re-experience getting up this morning. You can't. It's gone by. All you can do is look at the evidence for it. The fact that you're here tells you that you actually did get out of your bed this morning, okay? it might even be more accurate to say that history is a study of our present evidence of the past. Okay? The problem with writing and studying history is one of extremes. Sometimes we have too little evidence to study the past, and sometimes we have too much. So, for example, in the distant past, when you're studying history, I'm just going to dim the lights because this has got a picture with it. Okay? We could misinterpret. So let's say you were in an archaeological dig and you dug up an artifact and you're like, oh, this must have belonged to that ancient society. Here's what I think it was for. Now imagine our current society is wiped out. Say a meteor hits the world. That's a dark thing for this morning, but let's say it does. And then some aliens come and start excavating the dig site. And they find an artifact. And they go, oh, I think I just found a ceremonial necklace of this culture. See? Here's the way it works. The people of this society would put this around their heads, and they would use this in the background. And even on some of these artifacts, we found this little paper tape that I think was used to help hold the back to the head. And they would use this as an example of the type of ceremonial garb that we wore in today's society. Now, I hope you guys realize that's not what that device is actually used for. But can you imagine this could happen? Can you imagine that someone could misinterpret that? More accurately, can you imagine if this has occurred with our current study of ancient society? Do you think some of us have taken an artifact that we found and went, oh, I bet you it was used for this, and they were completely wrong? Okay. Now, this lack of evidence is a real problem in history, okay? So, for example, the only knowledge we have of a war that occurred in the 5th century between Persia and Greece is from one author, okay? And it was a Greek historian. Anyone see a problem with that? Well, Greece was one of the combatants in the war. We have no perspective from the Persian side at all. All we have is one Greek historian's perspective. It's the only record we have of that war at all. That could be a problem. That's too little evidence. Now, the problem with modern history is too much evidence. So, for example, 2013, write a history book of 2013. What would you put in it? So you'd put some stuff for like Canadian modern culture or maybe North American modern culture. Would you put in it what's happening in Bangladesh in the summer? Could you find that out? Is there a way to find out what happened in Bangladesh in the summer? Is there a way to find out what happened in pretty much every major city in this world over the summer of 2013? Would you put all that in there? Why not? It would be too much, right? Right. And so that's the problem we have with modern history is we have so much history. What makes the decision to put in there? Right? I remember one year when I did this in the TOK class, it was the year that Miley Cyrus did that thing at the music awards where she do you guys know what I'm talking about? Where she, yeah. And I said, would that make it? Would that go in that was only a couple years ago, right? And they said, yeah, probably would. Now, you guys, your yearbooks, they have that section like the year of your graduation, right? Like events. What makes the cut there? What gets put into your yearbooks in terms of historical events? Something to think about, isn't it? It's certainly not like what happened in the summer in Bangladesh, unless something happened there that seemed to have that big impact. And what determines that is not really set in stone what becomes important for history. But I think it's something to think about, okay? Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. That's a quote from Orwell, okay? How many of you have read 1984? What? What are you guys reading? How about Animal Farm? Okay, animal farm's better, by the way, in my opinion. Okay, it's shorter too. Really? It's better than 1984, in my opinion, but. It's about Stalin and Italy is what it's about. But okay. So obviously what we have here is an issue of significance. So let's take a look at what this means. Okay? History is not a record of everything. History is generally a record of significance or significant events. So like you guys said in that activity, the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001 was a pretty significant historical event. The bigger question is, why is it a significant historical event? Some would argue, well, it had a big impact on the society that it occurred within. It had an impact on the world as a whole, and those are good arguments, okay? But the fact that I ate a cheese sandwich on June 14th, 1987, I would say is not a historically significant event, okay? But that decision-making process of what is and what isn't significant has to have some sort of heuristic behind it. There has to be a method for deciding this is important, this is not important. And it doesn't seem like there is some set-in-stone way to determine that. Very much like our art unit, what is art and what is not art is kind of ambiguous at this point. Okay, so let's say we do have criteria, okay? So for example, we could say, okay, how many people were affected? That's a criteria. To what extent were they affected, right? Like the sun rising this morning affected the entire population of the planet Earth, right? But it maybe didn't impact them in any great significance because it happens almost every day, okay? Actually, it happens every day. Okay, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy that happened in the 1960s affected a lot of people significantly. Maybe more so than my high school grad in 1987, okay? Now, could our last TOK class have that significant impact on you? Well, only history will judge. So for example, let's say I made a comment last class that was that one thing that stuck in your head and made you decide to enter politics. And let's say you actually, in your political speech saying, I once took this class, I don't remember the name of the teacher, wore a lot of weird sweater vests on Wednesdays, but didn't matter. He said this one thing to me that always stuck in my head, and that's why I've entered politics. And you use this as the speech to help you eventually become Prime Minister of Canada. And you actually not only become the Prime Minister of Canada, but you eventually become the leader of the United Nations through your prime ministership in Canada and end up implying and creating policies that change the whole world. It's possible that that could occur if we look further along the way. Do you think that's happened in modern history? That some event that seemed insignificant at the time, now we look back on and as being very significant? Do you guys know who Seth MacFarlane is? He's the creator of Family Guy, right? The show Family Guy. So he's like a comedian, I guess he's a writer and artist. Did you know that he was supposed to be on the flight of September 11th? And because he was late for his flight, he missed the flight, but he was supposed to be on one of the flights that crashed into the buildings. He was supposed to be on that flight, and he'll often talk about that. That just being late that morning, being a guy who slept in and missed his flight, and being rich enough that don't worry, I'll miss the flight, I'll just catch the next one, I'll pay the fee and fly the next flight, was at the time not a big deal. But now when he looks back at it, incredibly historically significant to his life, okay? And I know about it because it was shown to me in an interview I saw of him, so somehow I now have that knowledge. So that just sleeping in that morning at the time seemed insignificant might now have a much larger significance. Okay. Okay, let's say this scenario happens. The world is destroyed, again through the meteor or say some nuclear war. And let's say it was so devastating that pretty much all of our buildings, our computers, everything on the planet Earth is destroyed. Like actually pulverized into nothingness, except for one thing. Your TOK journal from last year. All the stuff you wrote about grade 11 TOK, for me last year, is the only thing to survive. Imagine the aliens find that. Or let's say they find your physics notes, or your French notes, or your biology notes, with your writing in it. Imagine that they had to use that to construct the history of the entire planet Earth. That's a real extreme example, but it tells you again that idea that significance when deciding historical events is that reconstruction of history. Okay? Okay. So we're using evidence from the past and determining what's significant to create it. But history is more than just facts. Mr. McGuire will pound that in your head on the first day. History is also an interpretation of why events occurred. Not just what occurred, but why did they occur? Why did the Roman Empire collapse? What caused World War I? How did fascism rise in Nazi Germany? Those are bigger questions, not just what occurred, but why and how and stuff like that. Okay? This is a quote from Napoleon. I think it tells you quite a bit about his view of history. Okay, now this is obviously a question that a history teacher could answer quickly because it's cool, right? You may not necessarily see the immediate practical value of studying history. You'd be like, well, I don't like it. As a matter of fact, Henry Ford, a big American entrepreneur, one of the people considered the inventor of the modern car, described history as just bunk. Right? It's just, why bother? He said it's like it's yesterday's news. We should always be looking forward to the future. We shouldn't be worried about history at all. And a lot of people have that attitude, okay? That there is no actual reason to study history. Now, a historian would then justify it on the grounds that, one, it gives you a sense of the reality that you're currently in. Two, it's a defense against propaganda. And three, it enriches our understanding of human nature. What I want to focus on today is the second point. Can history defend you against propaganda? Okay? So, this idea of identity is a simple one, right? That if you don't know the history of a country, you can't really kind of experience that country. You kind of have to know its history to experience it. So for example, if you're trying to make sense of what's happening in the Middle East right now, you better have an understanding of the history of that particular part of the world, or you won't really understand what's going on there, okay? The idea of a defense against propaganda, I'm going to come back to in a minute, but this idea that history gives us a perspective that lets us see beyond what's immediately presented in front of us. Okay, now, at its worst, history can be used as an exploitation tool. A government can use history to, and supposedly change history, to justify things that it does, okay? So for example, in the Stalinist area in the former Soviet Union, okay, Stalin erased his opponents from the historical record of the Soviet Union. And you guys have studied that, right? You probably studied that exactly, right? Okay, so let's take a look at some pictures that try to show this. Mr. McGuire probably showed you some of these. Okay, so this is an original photo of the American Civil War generals in 1865. So photography is basically just first invented at this point. But unfortunately, some of the generals weren't there, okay? So later on, a photographer, okay, actually added some people into that. And this is before Photoshop, right? This is before that. So this was actually done with sort of like scissors and glue and things like that. So the actual addition, like for example, you see this man sitting in the chair here, is not in the original photograph, okay? So he was added in, as was this drape here. Why do you think the drape was added? Well, it covers up some of this wall here as this was added in. So this was just sort of, again, this was just sort of placed in front here to add into that photo because he wasn't there at the time of the photograph. Okay, now, this is probably the photo that those of you who've studied history with Mr. McGuire have seen. This is the original photo of the Russian Revolution, which has Lenin, okay, talking to the Red Army. So this is Lenin up here, you know, going into that, okay? But what you may also see in this is, who's this? Girls, who's that right there? You guys know? What's that? Okay, yeah. So that's Trotsky right there, okay? That's Trotsky. And Lenin didn't like that Trotsky was in the photograph. So he had him removed from the photograph. He changed the history of that photograph. Notice there, now that that's put in there. So even though he's there at the time of that big significant event, he had him removed from history. Now you might be thinking, okay, I get it, that in the past, dictators and people like that created changes in history to benefit them, okay? This is Hitler, 1937, okay? For some reason, they found this photo later. They found the original, and they found a version of it as well that had Joseph Goebbels removed from that photo. And it's a bad job. I don't know if you guys can see. There's actually, you can actually sort of see the cloudy sort of area there. They're not sure why he was ever removed, why that photo exists, because he was one of Hitler's closest allies in the Third Reich. But they don't know why that photo exists, but it does. Why was it used? What purpose was this to have it occur? We don't know. We kind of speculate why that occurred. Again, dictators, ancient history, this wouldn't happen in modern history, right? Do you guys know this photo? This is the Beatles' Abbey Road, 1960s photo. When this album was released in the United States, they took the cigarette out of Paul's hand. I don't know if you can see it right there. He had a cigarette in his hand. But when it was released in the United States, they thought that that was going to corrupt the youth. So they took it out. It was taken out of the photo. Okay? A simple change. That's the 1960s. This isn't dictators. This is just changing history in some ways just to, okay. This is 1989. Oprah Winfrey was put on the cover of TV Guide as the richest woman on TV. That was until Oprah saw this photograph. And another actress named Anne Margaret noticed this photograph, and she said, just a minute, that's me. That's me on the cover of TV Guide. They just removed my head, put Oprah's head on it, and, you know, did a few other little changes, like added a pile of money she was sitting on. Because Oprah also acknowledged, I don't remember taking a photograph sitting on a pile of money. This was in the 1980s, this was occurring, and it was the sort of start of people realizing that this was occurring. Now again, this is not necessarily that historically significant, it's just a sort of TV magazine. But this is 2008. In 2008, Iran was doing missile tests. And many of the major newspapers ran photographs of Iran doing these missile tests. But they didn't think the photo was good enough. This was the original photo. They thought it wasn't significant enough. This is the photo that went out in the newspapers because they added a missile. They thought it was a little more impactful. They added this missile right here, as opposed to the one here where it didn't actually fire. It misfired. That missile that the Iranians were testing didn't work, but they didn't want to show that. That's 2008. They were actually changing the history of what you were being presented. Could that be happening today? Of course it could, okay? What I say when I say studying history is important is it prevents you from falling into the trap of falling for propaganda if you understand the history a little bit of what's going on. Okay, now these are not everyday occurrences. These abuses of history are certainly rare, this idea of spinning history for your favor, but it certainly does happen, okay? I mean, we have an election today in this city, and very often politicians will suddenly develop this temporary amnesia when asked about their career as a politician, and they'll forget about all these sort of scandalous things that happened in their career and just remember all the good things that happened, okay? Okay, the last thing I would argue for history is that this idea that it enriches our understanding of human nature. You will never be, I'm pretty sure you will never be a pirate in the 17th century cruising the big seas. I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen to you. But through a study of history, you can kind of try to experience that through the historical record. That, I would argue, enriches your life. It makes your life better by studying a history of something that you cannot do. You maybe can't experience Bangladesh in the summer, but you could maybe read a history of it, okay? Now, so history isn't a sort of explanatory subject like, say, the natural sciences is, or the human sciences are, where they try to explain things. History isn't necessarily that. It isn't about explaining things, okay? But what it does do is it gives you a perspective that you can use in sort of your lives. And some of it's bleak. Some of it will give you a perspective that says, you know what? After studying history, war is just going to be something that's always with us as a human culture. We're just always going to be at war. We're always going to kill each other. That's just the nature of it. That would be a bleak perspective. Others might say that history proves that we are an advancing species, that we will continue to always push forward. Those are the kind of things that maybe you can gain from your study of history. Okay, so I guess I'm trying to throw out a little bit of hope here at the end of the day as we just wrap up. The last 200 years, just take 200 years of human history. There's been so much change in the last 200 years that it's amazing to think what will it look like 200 years from now, okay? I mean, look at what's happened in 200 years. Slavery was around before that. We abolished that. Women are now actually allowed to vote today. 200 years ago, you women couldn't vote today. You'd be not allowed to actually vote. For you girls, that's got to seem like an unrealistic world. That I can't even imagine that world exists, but it was only 200 years ago. The United Nations wasn't even around 200 years ago, and now it is, okay? All right. So I tried to spark an interest in some of you for history, mostly because most of you aren't studying history this year, and a little bit sad about that.